Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Great. A few reminders before we get started today. My name is Molly Marin. I'm the webinar coordinator for the New York State RTI Technical Assistance Center. You see the name Dane Marco Duchesre up there. It's really me today. Today is my last day with the TAC, my last webinar, so it's been great. I see some familiar names, and it's been nice seeing everybody online. Dane will be taking over from here, so that's why you see his name today. Just a few reminders. We have all upcoming professional development offerings on our webpage at nysrti.org. A copy of today's PowerPoint as well as 2 handouts are available on our webpage. I did put the link in the chat for you to get you directly there. Some people have trouble finding it with the new webpage, so that link will take you right there. During today's presentation, please use the chat box for any questions or comments that you may have. And at the end of today's presentation, if you could take a few minutes to complete a brief evaluation, we'd appreciate it. I'll post the link at the end. You'll also get it via email shortly after the webinar. We're very pleased to have back with us Dr. George Bash today to present our 5th and final webinar in our Strand 16, Response to Intervention, a Multi-Tiered System of Support series. Today's topic is ensuring the integration of academic skills, academic behavior expectations, and scaffolding to maximize student engagement within the instructional process. Dr. George Bash is a professor and director of the Institute for School Reform at the University of South Florida and director of the Florida Statewide Problem Solving RTI project for the Florida Department of Education. And at this time, it's my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Bash.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here, and I see some familiar names. This is the 5th and final one, as Molly said. I'm actually not in Florida today. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Hyannisport on the Cape. A number of us have been working to help implementation of MTSS in the school districts on the Cape and Islands, and I hear it's nice in New York. It's been pouring rain here all day today, and it's cold for a guy from Florida. So I turned on the video. After I did that, I realized I may have to explain away my funky glasses. My wife buys glasses for me, and I realized these are the only ones I had, so I had to explain the purple glasses. So before we get started, let's do the Get Acquainted poll here, just so I'll know, in addition to your names, who's on the line. So if you'll take a look at that and identify which position is closest to the one that you have for a school district. We can just watch it emerge here as everybody fills it out. Thanks, Kristen. I'm getting used to the glasses. Michelle, glad to see you have a group of administrators with you. Thanks for clarifying that. And Molly, Jennifer is asking about a CTLE number for professional development credit. Okay. Okay. That looks good. Half of the people are other. If you can, as we go along here, those of you who checked other, in the chat box, you can just put what your other position is, and that'll give me some sense. So good. Let's go ahead and get started. A couple of the slides at the beginning are going to be the same. These webinars, we're basically taking the all-day trainings that we did around the state of New York last year and then again this fall, and breaking them down into 5 webinars, separate webinars, so that people who could not attend the on-sites were able to would be able to get some of the context. We pretty much have the same kind of context, but naturally we're not as able to do as much tabletop work and case studies and those kinds of things because of the nature of the webinars. We've really talked a lot about all of the things that you see up on the screen, major components of MTSS, how they relate to Common Core learning standards. We're going to do more of that today. Aligning instruction and intervention with the standards, and integrating academic and behavior expectations. Today, what we're going to focus on is how do we integrate instruction across the tiers. So some of you might be general education teachers, some of you might be literacy specialists, some of you special education teachers, providing different levels of intensity. And I'm really glad to see administrators here because this really smacks at the lesson planning process. And how do we use that lesson planning process to integrate instruction? We'll talk about that throughout the day. The content today is going to be a little bit more focused, less general and more focused on unpacking the standards. How do we align our Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction and specially designed instruction for kids with disabilities with those Common Core state standards, but more importantly, how do we align that instruction across the tiers? So I think this is a lot of fun, but it also requires a lot of collaboration, and it requires leadership at a building level to do this well. I put this slide up here a couple of times. It's a quote from Maya Angelou: "Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better." I like that because with education constantly evolving, I think it's a good quote. Just as a reminder for those of you who may be new to this session, is we have 6 critical components to multi-tiered system of supports. What does leadership look like at the district and building level in MTSS? How do we differentiate instruction across the tiers? How do we use the problem-solving process when we really don't know what to do around the instruction process for academic and behavior? How do we use data to develop, implement, and evaluate instruction? Communication and collaboration are critical. We're really going to focus on that today. And capacity building infrastructure. A lot of people think infrastructure is more physical stuff. I really believe that infrastructure is tied to how much do we know as individuals, and as our knowledge and skills as individuals grows, and we use collaboration and communication, then we automatically build the capacity of our building to serve students better. So professional development is really critical to this capacity building. I put this up last time. I want to show it again. We really can't do much with Tier 2 and Tier 3 or special ed unless we have a quality core curriculum and quality core instruction. So we're going to kind of start with that today. I've had this slide up here once before too, and it's just a reminder. Standards-based instruction, you have a standard or a benchmark aligned to some course description. You all know that. And you identify learning goals, progression levels, whatever you want to call them. And then you, through lesson study or lesson planning, develop an engaging lesson around those learning goals. And I'm going to make a comment here today, just at this one point, that you can have the best instructional strategies in the world, the highest quality instructional strategies. But if the students are not engaged in those strategies, then there's not going to be much learning going on. A couple of webinars ago, I gave you the example of us doing observations in middle and high school classrooms. in which we were evaluating how much time teachers spent with different types of instruction, explicit instruction, teacher modeling with teacher support, teacher modeling with peer support, independent practice, all of those types of things. And we evaluated how much time teachers spent with each one of those strategies. And at the same time, we took data on student engagement. And what we found in the example I gave you in one of the webinars, 2 webinars ago, I think, was that teachers were certainly capable of providing all of those different types of instructional strategies. They were good at it, but they had favorites. And what we found out in the case study I gave you was that the strategies that the teachers were using 67% of the time had less than 50% student engagement. And the strategies the teachers were using a third of the time had 85% student engagement. So this relationship between the instructional strategies and student engagement is critical. And for teachers who do collegial supervision, where you observe each other, give each other feedback, and for administrators doing classroom observations, I really encourage you to look into this issue of collecting data simultaneously on the type of instructional strategy, the amount of time that strategy is used, and the level of student engagement with that strategy. In the middle and high school example, we were able to improve student outcomes dramatically once the teacher knew that if I used these 3 instructional approaches, I had 85% student engagement. And those were skills teachers already had, but they were not aware of the different levels of student engagement. And then, once again, using the assessments to manage that. So as we start looking at instruction and the cognitive demand of the Common Core Learning Standards, I think all of you know that those standards incorporate Webb's depth of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy, and that the cognitive demand of the standard rises across the grades. So the lowest level of cognitive demand is simply remembering. The highest level is creating. And in between, we have understanding, applying, analyzing, and evaluating. What I want to point out here and ask you to remember as we take a look at some cases today is when you have students at different levels of performance. We talk about differentiating instruction. We all know what that means. But as we move up the grades, you may have standards that are focusing on applying or analyzing, but you have students with skills at the remembering level. So there are going to be frequent occasions, particularly as kids get older, where Tier 2 or Tier 3 or specially designed instruction is trying to bridge the gap between the standard that is demanding, analyzing, applying in Tier 1 in general education with the kind of instruction you're focused on in those tiers or with specially designed instruction. So I'll give you one quick example. If we have a student at 6th grade who has reading fluency at the 2nd grade level, but with listening comprehension, that student can understand and comprehend 6th grade material. If you're a special ed teacher, your IEP may be focused on remembering or understanding. And that's the level that you've got your instruction around, where in the general ed classroom, the standard expects analyzing and applying. So I want you to just try to remember, because I can't keep coming back to this slide, remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So let's just take a quick look here at these. This is a comprehension standard for literature for kindergarten through grade 12. Take a look at the kindergarten standard. With prompting and support, retell familiar stories, including key details. Go back to the triangle. That is purely remembering. What did you hear, and can you regurgitate it? As we look at the first grade standard, we see the term understanding come in here. Go back to the triangle. We've now moved the cognitive demand and the rigor from not only remembering, but now understanding. If we look at applying, we can jump ahead and see that there are demands for explaining, for applying it as early as third grade, applying it to myths from diverse cultures. So I'm not going to go through any more of these if in any detail, but you'll see that at the 7th grade, the term analyzing comes into that standard. So the cognitive rigor has been increased. So as we are looking at tiered instruction, it is often the case that kids getting Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction and specially designed instruction have instruction that has a much lower cognitive demand because of their skill levels. And one of the reasons why students with disabilities, for example, don't do very well on high-stakes assessments is because we tend to focus their instruction because of some of the basics are missing. We tend to focus that instruction, let's say a 5th grade or a 6th grade student, we focus that instruction at the bottom of that rigor triangle, but your state assessments are assessing it at a much higher level. So when we talk about integrating instruction, we're really talking about integrating Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed instruction into Tier 1. And we, as Tier 2, Tier 3, specially designed instruction providers, we have to always think about what is that cognitive demand and cognitive rigor at Tier 1. So we'll keep coming back to that. And I'm just skipping through these slides because they have some emphasis I don't care about right now. The next thing that you have is, and I have it up here, it says at the top, standards-based IEP instructional planning. I put that there, but the stuff that I gave you doesn't have the IEP on it. The point is this can be used for kids with disabilities as well as general education kids. So very quickly, I would like for you to pay attention, and we're going to go through a couple of exercises here. And it's kind of hard to do this. It's kind of hard for me to do it because I don't get to see you and we don't get to interact. But take a look at the standard. Determine a theme or central idea of a text and how it is conveyed through particular details. Provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinions or judgments. When we unpack standards, the verbs in the sentence are what we expect the students to do, and the nouns in the sentence are in the standard are what we expect students to know. So I want you to just take a moment, and I'd like you to use the chat box. You all don't have to, but as many of you as care to, please feel free. In the chat box, identify the nouns in that standard. What is it we want students to know? Ignore the verbs for now, and just type in some of the nouns, what we want kids to know in that standard. Sure, theme, central idea, details, text, opinion, judgment, summary, theme or central idea, absolutely. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, do students have the vocabulary for the standard, or do we have to translate it? Sometimes a theme, a central idea is also a main idea, or it's the main thing in the story. So we have to often translate these terms for kids who are getting more intensive instruction. So what we're really asking the students here to do is to be able to identify the main idea and the details that support the main idea, and to provide an objective summary. So don't put in there what you think or say if it's good or bad. It's just tell us exactly what you heard. What do students have to do? What are the verbs here? Sure. Determine, provide, convey. So now that we know what the standard is asking a student to do, determine some things, convey some things, and provide some things. If you look at that standard and now go down to the small letter A, what skills, what specific skills would be necessary for a student if the student was given a paragraph and expected to demonstrate that standard? So as a teacher, you're providing your students with a paragraph, and you're asking them to determine the theme or central. What are the skills a student has to have in order to do that? Awesome, Sheila. And I'm gonna just to keep us moving here. You guys keep typing, but yeah, read it fluently, determine what the gist of a paragraph is. Sheila said read for comprehension, write clearly, conveying the ideas with details from the text. Awesome. What if you have students that can't do that? And you're a 5th grade teacher. What if they can't read fluently? What if they can't write? You know, if kids can't read, as you know, they can't spell. And if they're passing their spelling test every week and their reading fluency is below grade level, it's because somebody's working with them to memorize letter sequences. When I was a building principal and worked in classrooms, teachers would say, I can't believe this kid is passing 5th grade spelling test when he's reading at the 2nd grade level. I would ask the teacher to take the words the kid spelled correctly and wait 48 hours and then ask the kid to read the words that he or she spelled, and of course they can't because they just memorized them. Here's what's cool about the standards, folks. It doesn't say you have to read it. It doesn't say that you have to write it. And that's a key here, because this standard is not assessing lower level skills. What it is assessing is higher order thinking, higher levels of cognitive demand and rigor. This standard doesn't care how a kid gets the information in or how the kid gives it out. It's trying to measure whether this kid can give a central idea, back it up with details, and provide a succinct objective summary. So what do we do then? How do we begin to break instruction down when we have a 6th grade kid reading fluently at the 2nd grade level, but can comprehend what's in the passage as long as he or she doesn't have to actually read it? They know what words mean for words they can't read. And what if they can't write? How do we as teachers determine if the kid can meet the standard? And one of the things that has been so helpful to us in the state I'm in is that we finally broke away from an assumption that these higher order standards require that you read fluently or require that you write clearly. What if you can speak clearly and you're accurate? Then we just have a reading fluency problem. We don't have a higher order thinking problem. And we need to separate those things out. So what access skills are necessary for this standard? It depends on the demand that you as a teacher put on the kids. So if you give all the kids a paragraph, like I set you up for this, and I was so glad to see Sheila wrote everything I was hoping somebody would write. Because naturally that's what we would expect. But once again, what if the student can't do that? So a couple of times ago, we talked about universal design for learning, and there are 3 principles. How do we have different methods of representing or presenting a curriculum? That's principle 1. Principle 2 is how many different ways of student performance can we allow? And number 3, that students are engaged when we have presentation formats that they understand and performance formats that they can do. So if we take a look at this how we break down our instructional planning, we first identify what access skills are necessary for the standard at the typical grade level. So Sheila and others of you wrote down exactly what you would expect at the 5th grade level. You give them a paragraph, they read it fluently, and they write out their answers. That's pretty typical. But what skill do the students that we're concerned about not possess? So it may be reading fluency. It may be writing fluency. So how do we then integrate Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed instruction into this process? What academic engagement must the student have to engage instruction? So the student clearly has to be able to focus on a reading paragraph, sustain attention, use memory strategies, etc. So if we organize that instruction requiring academic behaviors that students don't have, they're going to disengage. We'll come back to that. Now look at the essential questions down at the bottom. Universal design for learning strategies can be used to neutralize the skills that the kid doesn't have that are critical to access the content for the standard. So let me be specific. A student who cannot read fluently at the 6th grade level, but can understand it near that level. Universal design like text-to-speech books on tape and speech to text could be used to eliminate or neutralize the skills the kid doesn't possess in order to demonstrate the kid has the cognitive rigor that the standard expects. So we would, let's just say we had text-to-speech, and if you have text-to-speech, you have speech-to-text, so that the student listens to the paragraph read to him or her, and then they are able to verbalize the central idea, the key details, and the objective summary. And when they verbally summarize it, that computer program puts it out into sentences for a teacher then to be able to evaluate. So the essential questions at the bottom are really tied to B. Which skills does this student not possess? And can we use universal design to take care of those if they are the barriers to accessing the standard? We're going to deal with questions 2 and 3 when we go through how do we actually integrate in the lesson planning process. I just want to glance at your comments and see if you have any questions. Yeah, some good, excellent comment. Yes, the student can use technology. Absolutely. You know, and I see Christine has rubric here. Let me give, and maybe you're talking about an assessment rubric or a selection rubric. I'm not sure which, but let's just assume, Christine, you're talking about an assessment rubric. I've had teachers, typically 3rd, 4th grade teachers with this kind of standard, allow kids who can't write clearly to draw a picture with the explicit instruction is that the picture has to have the details that you remember. So let's say in the paragraph you gave the students, there were 5 details that support that main idea. And you have other kids writing sentences, writing an objective summary to rephrase the paragraph in their own words. And what you're going to do when you grade that is that you're going to look for all 5 details. And you're going to have some kind of scoring rubric for students who got 3 details, 4 details, 5 details. If you had a student draw a picture, you could grade it the same way. How many of the details are represented graphically as opposed to words in a sentence? So you could apply the same scoring rubric to a picture that you could apply to a written language product in order to assess the cognitive rigor that that student is demonstrating. So I hope that makes some sense as we move ahead. So let me just summarize this. We don't, in my state, we don't call it lesson planning. We call it lesson study. And we do this type of planning using this sheet in grade level or subject area teams. And we're going to come back to exactly how this is used. But here are kind of guiding questions that are built into this. So as a team is looking at the standard, let's say it's this one, then they unpack the standards. What do kids have to do? What do they have to know? What access skills are necessary for this standard, for this grade level? So once again, 5th grade, reading it, writing it. What about the kids who can't do that? So we start building this idea of differentiation or accommodation into the lesson planning process. We don't wait for kids to fail at it and then backfill it. We anticipate it through this lesson planning process. We then do a gut check around engagement, and then we look at the essential questions, particularly the ones that you folks got to around universal design. And built into this lesson planning process, we're always thinking about those three principles. How many different ways can this instruction be represented? It could be represented by reading it to the students. It could be represented by students watching a videotape or something on their PDA. It could be text-to-speech from a computer. It could be a variety of things. And then how are the different ways that we're going to allow students to communicate what they've learned? Writing it, drawing a picture, verbalizing it, so that ahead of time we know what we're going to be doing with different students. So it's kind of our cheat sheet for lesson planning. So let's take this case study. Now, you should have a really clear copy of this as something that you downloaded for today's session. I sent you a PDF of it because I knew you wouldn't really be able to look at this. This is a planning sheet used by the state of Indiana that builds these concepts in that we just talked about. So if you can just read, this is that 6th grade kid at the 2nd grade level. If you can read that here for a moment, I'll give you a moment to read it so that you get information about the student. Just take a moment to read it. Let me see if I can find the PDF that I sent you. Okay, I did. So in case you don't have it, I'll read it for you here. Ryan is a 6th grader with a specific learning disability in reading. According to recent evaluation data, his reading comprehension level when he must code independently is 4 years behind that of his grade level peers. He specifically struggles with oral reading fluency. He can currently read 26 words correct per minute from a 2nd grade level text. He can answer 35% of the comprehension questions about the text if he reads it independently. When grade level material is read aloud to him, listening comprehension, he is able to understand the material and answer comprehension questions appropriate for his age and grade level. So if that's the situation, excuse me, if that's the situation, as a general education classroom teacher, your hands are kind of tied here because 4 years below grade level is really too difficult for any kind of differentiation to speak of. So we're going to have to say, how do we keep this kid afloat in Tier 1? Well, how do we utilize intensified instruction and specially designed instruction to bring that fluency along? But how do we do that while we're maintaining content? That's the issue. So the second step is they write down the standard, just like we had a few minutes ago. They then identify the access skills necessary for students to be able to do that standard. Then they identify what accommodations are needed to help that kid have access in the general education classroom, any modifications to the general ed instruction, and then what do support teachers, whether they're special ed, Tier 2 or Tier 3, what do they do to support what's going on in general ed? And how do we integrate all of that? So I gave you this case study in case you want to use it at a later time frame. So each of these slides is really just breaking down what I just went through. It's another process that you can use. So with everything that we've talked about so far, let's talk about how we integrate the instruction. So I would like to ask you to just think about, for a moment, how is lesson planning done in your building? If you're an administrator, whether that's at the district level or the building level, how is lesson planning done, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school? And I want you to get, picture in your head, whether you're professional learning communities at a grade level, your fifth grade teachers, third grade teachers, together are doing lesson planning around the standards, whether it's by department at the high school, department and grade level. But I just want you to think about the last lesson planning meeting that you were in. Just think about that for a moment. What did it look like? Who was there? What did you talk about? And I'm going to throw some hypotheses out. I'm going to throw a hypothesis out, and if this is not your case, awesome. But I think that this is what typically happens. Who's at the lesson planning meeting are general education teachers for that subject area or that grade level. The other people who provide instruction to students in those classrooms typically are not at the lesson planning. So because they're not there, they don't know the scope and sequence. They don't know your pacing chart. In other words, they don't know how to align their instruction, whether it's supplemental or intensive reading supports, whether it's specially designed instruction by a special ed teacher, whether it's behavioral instruction by a behavior specialist, a school psychologist, a social worker. If they don't know what you're doing on any given day in that general ed classroom, and they can't align their instruction with your pacing, then the instruction may be very good, but everybody is instructing in silos. So a quick example. If a special ed teacher or a reading teacher is working very hard to improve student fluency or comprehension, vocabulary, and they're using, let's say, Wilson's Foundations or some other evidence-based program to do that type of thing, that's all well and good. But let's take vocabulary, for example. Why would we be building student vocabulary through Tier 2, Tier 3, or specially designed instruction? To build vocabulary using vocabulary words that are not the words the kid needs tomorrow in the general ed classroom to understand the lesson. So if we're building fluency, why would we be building fluency? Teaching those kids strategies is great, but why would we be practicing those strategies on words that are in materials separate from what the kid's using in the general ed classroom? Even a sixth grade social studies book has first grade words, second grade words, third grade words. So we could be practicing those fluency strategies on the actual content from the Tier 1 material. And if we have the pacing chart, if that special ed teacher knows that you're on these 3 pages next Tuesday, then they could be embedding their instruction in that material so that they're in essence pre-teaching students material they need for Tier 1. And you and I both know that the most powerful instructional strategies for kids who struggle is pre-teach, review, and reteach. So I'm asking you to think about when we have other instructional providers who are working very, very hard, are they working smart? And my definition of smart is when other instructional providers are utilizing the pacing and the materials in Tier 1 to apply their specially designed instructional strategies to, as opposed to separate stuff. If we can pre-teach kids who struggle, that is one of the strongest ways to improve their engagement in the general education classroom. They've heard it before, they understand it, they know what the vocabulary is, and they can participate because they have accessed the content. So that's a central theme to lesson study. It's a method to integrate academic and behavior instruction across the tiers into a single system. It integrates learning goals, instructional strategies, pacing across the tiers. I'm going to be very direct here. We cannot have instruction going on outside of Tier 1 that is not aligned with Tier 1 and expect kids to be able to stay engaged in Tier 1, or more importantly, I mean, you and I also both know that your high-stakes assessment in New York is aligned with your standards, which instructionally is found in Tier 1. Those assessments are not aligned with Wilson's Foundations. So one of the reasons why kids who get Tier 2 and Tier 3 services and specially designed instruction tend to do less well on the high-stakes assessments is because they have been practicing a lot of their day on content that is not aligned with the standards, the assessments aligned with the standards, and that's what it's going to assess. So there's a lot of reasons to look at this integration process. So I've kind of given an overview of it. Let's go through the steps of it quickly. All providers of instruction and support are in attendance at the lesson study meetings. So we do lesson study, these big meetings, once a month. And we break them down into the 4 weeks. So for this standard, what are we going to do on week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4 in the month of November? Now, what does that look like at one of these meetings? We could have one big table, or however you arrange it. However, initially in this first step, the general education teachers do the talking. They identify the standard, the learning goals, the progression levels they're going to do that month, and talk about how they're going to teach it and how they expect kids to perform it. The reading specialists, the special ed teachers, if it's behavior, you might have a school psychologist there, whoever is working with students at that grade level. They are taking notes around our students are going to struggle with that. How are we going to neutralize the fluency thing so the kid gets the content? The kid can't write. What are alternatives? And the notes that they're taking not only are going to give a heads up for barriers in Tier 1, but they're taking notes about how they can pre-teach, review, and reteach in their supplemental, intensive, and specially designed, how they can embed what is going to happen in Tier 1 into their instruction. So, question moving forward. Who's at your lesson planning? Do all the providers of instruction attend or have knowledge about pacing charts, etc.? This is communication and collaboration. There's a lot of ways to do this. The goal is this. Other instructional providers have to know the scope sequence pacing. They have to know what material kids are going to be using when in Tier 1. So a resource class, a support class to reinforce, yes, absolutely. Anything that does pre-teach, review, and reteach. So I'm going to digress here for a moment. I was a building principal for 10 or 12 years. And when I used to do evaluations and walkthroughs, I always started my evaluations and walkthroughs with Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed providers. I was principal of a K through 8 school where it was a big school. We had about 40 teachers. We had lots of our population was getting supportive services and had extra needs. I wanted to first look at what Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed instruction they were getting, so that when I went and observed in the general ed classroom, I could see how much that instruction was relevant content-wise and strategy-wise to what was going on in general ed, and I could then put a context as to why these students were or were not engaged. So a general question for policymakers at the district or building principals: do you have expectations to evaluate, observe Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed instruction in the same ways that you're evaluating instruction in Tier 1? And if you're observing in Tier 1, how do you know if for those special ed kids, for those kids getting extra reading instruction, for the kids getting Tier 2 and Tier 3, when you see them in that general ed class, how do you know if the other instruction that they're getting, which by the way is very expensive instruction, how do you know if it's aligned? That's the question. So for Tier 1, I've already said this is just a guide for you. The learning goal standards are identified explicitly. Instructional strategies, evidence-based for the goal level and student skill levels are identified. And by the way, in almost every school that I work in, all of the teachers have Hattie's book, Hattie. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but to look at impact levels for different instructional approaches for different subject areas and grade levels. You know that book gives effect sizes. The bigger the number of the effect size, the more evidence-based the strategy is for the content and the age level. And the explicit student performance behaviors necessary to engage the instruction are identified. And gaps for individual students are identified. So if a student can't write fluently, what are we going to do about those 3 kids whose written language is insufficient to convey what they know? What's our backup plan? So that's the Tier 1 focus. Let me read here. For Tier 2 and Tier 3 and specially designed instruction, the Tier 2 and Tier 3 providers meet separately after this lesson study to plan their instruction within the context of what they heard in that Tier 1 lesson planning meeting. Instructional strategies, engagement behaviors, instructional materials that support student success in Tier 1 are identified. So what materials are they going to use? And by the way, if you have kids going to Tier 2 or Tier 3 providers, whether that's push in or pull out, or specially designed instruction providers, if they take their books back and forth, either in the classroom to that person or outside of the classroom to a resource room or a literacy support room, that increases student engagement because they know that what they're learning to do is tied directly to what they're doing in Tier 1. We tend to see more of that with push-in. We see a lot less of it with pull-out. Tier 2, Tier 3 specially designed, they align with the pacing chart. It's always a priority for identifying the focus of instruction on a weekly basis. The alignment permits you to work with vocabulary, background knowledge, that results in your Tier 2, Tier 3 specially designed being just-in-time readiness. They take the instruction you're giving them and they apply it immediately in Tier 1. The assessments in Tier 2 and Tier 3 incorporate the characteristics of assessments in Tier 1. So based upon the assessments that the teacher in Tier 1 is using, let's say that they're using multiple choice, or they're using a closed procedure, or they're using writing sentences. How as you do assessments in Tier 2, Tier 3 specially designed, how can you build in training and practice with those assessment formats in your setting that mimic to some degree what is being used in Tier 1? The goal here is not only to ensure that students strengthen their skills, but that they accelerate their growth. The students should be able to explicitly say how the instruction that they're getting in Tier 2, 3 are specially designed. How does that relate to what's happening in the general ed classroom? How does that instruction help them participate more and do better in Tier 1, if that makes sense? Tier 2 and Tier 3 providers, and this is something to kind of gut check, well, let's say that you're providing literacy support, math support, you're a special ed teacher. How often do you go and observe your students in that Tier 1 setting to evaluate how well the instruction that you're giving them is transferring to Tier 1? What barriers do you see? When doing those observations in Tier 1, how does that give you ideas to modify your instruction with that student, those students in small group or individual? Tier 2 and Tier 3 providers take an active role in the Tier 1 lesson study to share specifically designed instructional strategies and student engagement supports during Tier 1. So let me give you an example. In one of the other webinars, we talked about what does Tier 3 look like? What does Tier 3 instruction look like? Typically, Tier 3 instruction for us is, if you'll remember, but I'm going to summarize it very quickly in case you weren't on one of those webinars, is errorless learning. In Tier 3, we want the instruction to be intensive, and by that we mean sufficiently scaffolded so that students will give correct answers to whether it's academics or behavior to that instruction. For students getting Tier 3 instruction, in general, there's a 95% chance that they will not be able to answer an academic question correctly or make the correct behavioral choice. They're so far behind that they can't do that. And if we level the instruction in Tier 3 to their instructional level, for the case example we have here, that would be 4 years below 6th grade level for a 6th grade student. So there would be little or no application or transfer to the 6th grade classroom. So let's take a math example. Let's say that a student understands the algorithm. They understand the concept of adding. They understand the concept of subtraction, take away, dividing. They even understand the concept of multiplying. but they can't remember math facts. They simply cannot do it. So whereas that Tier 3 provider or the special ed teacher may be focusing instruction on trying to get them to do better with those basic skills, when they're working on the algorithm, that teacher is going to have to scaffold it. So going to have to give the kid prompts to be able to do the task accurately. And it's very intensive instruction. Well, how does a general education teacher do that? I think the answer is pretty easy. General education teachers typically walk around the room providing instructional support for students. And they typically provide more instructional support for struggling students. So think about this for a moment. Let's say that we have a student, Juan, and Juan cannot do a 5th or 6th grade math algorithm because he can't do the math facts, and he gets some of the instructional sequences out of order. And maybe it's a memory issue that affects both the facts and the instructional sequences. And let's say that the math teacher typically during a 50-minute lesson comes by Juan's desk 5 times, once every 10 minutes, or maybe more, but let's just say 5 times. And what the teacher has been doing is undoing what Juan did, saying, no, let's start that over. Let's take it one step at a time, because Juan can't do it independently. So what's happening is that except when that teacher's there, Juan is practicing it the wrong way. So for the vast majority of the time, Juan is practicing it the wrong way, and so the wrong way strategies are getting stronger and the right way strategies are getting weaker. But let's say that we have a special ed teacher who is using specially designed strategies, scaffolding heavily in order to help the kid with the sequences and the math facts. If that special ed teacher provides the general ed teacher with what that scaffolding looks like, then I submit to you that that 5th or 6th grade teacher could have 2 activities on Juan's desk. One activity that he can do independently with accuracy, and one grade level activity. And that when the teacher comes by, the teacher focuses on the grade level activity, utilizing those specially designed intensive strategies the special ed teacher taught the teacher how to do. And during those 5 times, which is not any more than that general ed teacher would normally do, it's what the teacher does differently in those 5 times. That general ed teacher can become a specially designed instructional teacher if they know the sequences. They don't have to spend any more extra time with one. But for the 5 instructional events, they are doing the same thing that that special ed teacher is doing when they provide instruction to the student. And when the general ed teacher cannot be with the student is not practicing bad habits. The student is strengthening some skills at their instructional level. So this involves no more special time for the Tier 1 teacher. It does involve that the Tier 1 teacher do something differently during the time that they are spending with the student, but you have a support teacher to teach the teacher how to do that. And now what's happening is Juan not only gets specially designed instruction from, let's say, the SLD teacher, but Juan is getting specially designed instruction in Tier 1 as well. So if that teacher spends 5 instructional moments a day with Juan for 5 days a week. That's 25 more instructional events that are aligned with Tier 3. Tier 3 is aligned with Tier 1. And it's like having another special ed teacher because the kid got 25 instructional moments. But it took no more of the general education teacher's time. But because they each knew what each other was doing, they aligned their instruction. And naturally occurring instruction in Tier 1 basically now is accelerating this kid much faster. So I'm going to stop there. We have about 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less because you have to do the evaluation. What are your thoughts? Does any of this make sense to you? And think about how many kids you have that are getting Tier 2, Tier 3, and specially designed. You know, we talked about a lot today. What of this makes sense to you, and what of this are ideas that you think you could do to better integrate your instruction in a multi-tiered system? So I'm going to shut up for a few minutes and see what you're writing. I hope it makes some sense. Lots of people are typing at once, so it's a little slow on the uptake here. Yeah, Sheila, I totally agree with what you're saying. So you don't have to do this all at once. Every time that I've done something in a school, whether I'm as a building principal, whether at a classroom level, at a school level, as a support person, I try to find somebody who likes me and I like them, and we kind of are on the same page with things, and we try something different. And we don't even tell other people we're doing it. We just try it. And then when we kind of get the bugs worked out and we see some results, we start sharing that at a staff meeting, at a grade level meeting, after we've already done it, and we can give examples of what it looks like. So I don't know how you kind of get new stuff introduced into your building. There's a lot of ways to do it. Often I like this informal way the best. Small steps. I see some more people writing up here. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So mandated, I guess, comes in different ways. And I appreciate, by the way, Sheila, I appreciate all the thoughtfulness in your comments. So I believe that what is inspected is respected. And I can tell you that when I was a building principal, as soon as I said that I wanted to, that I was going to start doing walkthroughs and observations, not only in the general ed classroom, but all of the other instructional settings. That included speech and language. It included everything, to see how well we were integrating content, adding value. If the speech therapist is working on words with kids, let's say that it's either language or it may be articulation or something, why not pick words out of the content from the classroom? Why pick them off out of something else? So everywhere I went, for people, different people working with the same kids, I kind of put myself in the position of that kid and said, does what this person is, they're trying to teach me, how does that relate to what I'm doing over here, and over here? And as soon as I started doing that, rather than mandating it, but saying that I was going to look to see how well we were integrating, before I was a building principal, no principal had gone in to look at special ed instruction. Nobody had gone in to look at reading instruction as part of walkthroughs and instructional rounds. It was just tier 1. So just the process of my doing that changed the climate in a way that was not threatening. And it became expected to be inspected. And all of a sudden people got on board with it. Yes, I'm familiar with AIS. And in our on-site sessions, we talked a lot about how AIS could incorporate this type of thing. We had a lot of good instructions. Co-teaching is wonderful. I'm going to say something about co-teaching. I'm going to say something bad and then kind of back off on it a little bit. All of the research on co-teaching, all of the real research on co-teaching shows it has no effect. None. And most of it's anecdotal. Co-teaching is very popular because it's very collegial and all of those kind of interpersonal things. But co-teaching can be effective if strategies such as this integration are utilized, particularly pre-teaching, review, and reteaching that is aligned with the pacing, and that intensive instruction is used to get around those student weaknesses that are denying access to higher level content. So as long as the co-teaching is done with a pedagogy, and the big pedagogy is pre-teach, review, reteach. Utilize instructional strategies, but utilize the content. So the pedagogy makes the difference. And it's like doing Dancing with the Stars. Though it has to be perfectly choreographed or everybody falls down. So if you could combine some of this, you might be happier with your co-teaching. Hopefully these classes are supporting the students in mastery of the basic. Yes, in mastery of the basic fundamentals, absolutely, Christine. But in the basic fundamentals, utilizing content that, so once again, we can practice fluency, but if we practice fluency on words that are at grade level or in the grade level text, then it's more likely that in practicing those words, students are also going to acquire content. We always we want to focus on fundamentals, but not at the expense of content. And that integrating them is the trick. I really appreciate that comment. Well, folks, it looks like our time is up. I hope that today you felt this was worth your time. It's one of my favorite subjects, and however, it's the one that we need to spend the most time on. So I'm hoping that you will have some courageous conversations with like-minded people to try out some of this stuff, or to say, how can I use some of this in what I'm already doing? So once again, I'm always honored that you would take your time to spend in this webinar. So thank you very, very much. And I hope you have a good holiday upcoming and a wonderful new year. So Molly, do you have any concluding things that you want to do.
I just posted the link to the survey, and it'll come again via email, so you can grab it either way. But thank you so much, Dr. Bash. It's been a wonderful webinar series, and we appreciate your time, and look forward to getting those surveys back from everybody. Everybody have a good night.
And for those of you who are thinking about winter vacations, come to Florida and spend your money and support our tax base. Thanks a lot.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.